before money, before kings, before empires carved their names into stone. There was a mineral so precious that men would kill for it, cities would rise around it, and entire civilizations would crumble without it. This white crystal didn't just preserve food or flavor meals. It controlled armies. It funded wars. It decided who lived and who starved. And for thousands of years, those who controlled it controlled the world. The modern illusion. Walk into any store today and salt costs almost nothing. A container that would last months sits on shelves for less than the price of a coffee. We scatter it carelessly over food, melt ice with it, never questioning its abundance. This ordinariness is a lie of the modern age. For most of human history, salt was worth more than gold. Wars were fought over it. Revolutions ignited because of it. The salt trade empires that rose and fell shaped the geography of power in ways we've forgotten, but still live within. The history of salt is the hidden architecture of civilization itself. It determined where cities were built, which routes became highways of commerce, and which rulers could sustain their grip on power. Understanding salt and civilization means understanding how a basic human need transformed into the ultimate instrument of control, how something essential became something weaponized. The story begins not in markets or mines, but in the bodies of our ancestors, in the chemical necessity that made salt different from every other resource on Earth. The first hunger. 10,000 years ago, as humans transitioned from hunting and gathering to agriculture, they faced a crisis written in their blood. The human body requires sodium to function. Every nerve impulse, every muscle contraction, every thought firing across synapses depends on salt. Hunter-gatherers obtained enough sodium from animal blood and organs, but agricultural peoples, eating primarily grains and vegetables, began to suffer from salt deficiency. Weakness, muscle cramps, death. This wasn't just about health, it was about survival of entire communities. The ancient salt trade began as a matter of life itself. The earliest evidence of salt harvesting dates back to 650 BCE in Romania, at a site called Poiana Slatinei. Archaeological excavations reveal not just salt extraction, but something more complex. The beginning of specialized labor, of trade networks, of social hierarchies forming around a resource. By 6000 BCE, salt production sites in China show organized operations involving hundreds of workers. These weren't random gatherings. They were the seeds of something darker. The first evidence of humans organizing other humans around the control of an essential substance. In ancient civilizations across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, salt became sacred. Egyptian texts describe salt used in mummification, preserving the bodies of pharaohs for eternity. But preservation of the dead was merely symbol. The real power lay in preserving the living. Salt allowed food to be stored through seasons, through droughts, through sieges. A city with salt reserves could withstand an army at its gates. A city without salt would surrender or starve. The Phoenicians understood this before most. By 1200 BCE, they had established salt evaporation ponds along the Mediterranean coast, transforming seawater into crystalline wealth. They didn't just trade salt. They traded time itself, the ability to move food across oceans without spoilage, to feed sailors on voyages that would discover new worlds. Salt in ancient civilizations wasn't just preserved meat, it was preserved possibility. But possibility for whom? This is where the story darkens. The architecture of control. By the time recorded history begins in earnest, salt production sites were already centers of power. The Chinese in the Jia dynasty, around 2000 BCE, had developed the first known salt taxation systems. This wasn't merely collecting revenue. Salt taxation and control represented something more fundamental. The realization that controlling an essential resource meant controlling people themselves. The emperor's bureaucrats didn't need to conquer every village or monitor every family. They simply controlled salt. Everyone needed it. Everyone had to come to approved sources. Everyone had to pay. The first great systems of mass surveillance and control weren't built on ideology or fear. They were built on biology, on the body's unignorable need. The Roman Empire perfected this understanding into an empire-wide machine. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was one of Rome's oldest and most important routes, carrying salt from the coastal marshes at Ostia into the heart of Italy. But the road wasn't built for convenience. It was built for control. Roman soldiers were paid partly in salt, the origin of the word salary. This wasn't generosity, it was strategy. By making salt a form of currency, by tying military loyalty to salt distribution, Rome ensured that its armies remained dependent on the state. Soldiers who controlled salt routes for Rome were simultaneously controlled by them. The scale is staggering when mapped out. Roman salt production sites stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Black Sea. Each site required workers, thousands of them. Many were slaves, many were conquered peoples. The salt marshes of ancient Rome were places of brutal labor, where men and women worked in caustic brine that burned their skin, breathed air thick with salt that scarred their lungs. The salt that preserved food preserved an empire built on suffering. But Rome wasn't unique. It was simply the most successful iteration of a pattern that had already emerged everywhere humans settled. The Great Salt Routes. Follow the salt routes history across the medieval world and you're following the arteries of power itself. The Saharan salt trade created kingdoms in West Africa that rivaled European powers in wealth and sophistication. The salt mines of Taghaza, deep in the Sahara, produced white gold that caravans carried south to exchange for actual gold in Timbuktu and other trading cities. This wasn't peripheral commerce. This was how salt shaped empires. The Empire of Ghana, and later Mali, built their treasuries on salt taxation. Merchants crossing the desert paid fees at every checkpoint, every oasis, every city gate. The kings didn't control the mines. They were too far away, too isolated. But they controlled the routes, the markets, the scales where salt was weighed. Control the infrastructure of trade, and you control the trade itself. In Europe, the same pattern repeated with different geography. The medieval salt routes ran through the Alps, across the Baltic, down the rivers of France. Cities like Venice and Genoa grew wealthy as intermediaries, controlling not production, but distribution. The Venetian monopoly on salt distribution across the Adriatic turned a city built on swampland into a maritime superpower that challenged empires. The Hanseatic League, that medieval trade confederation of Germanic cities, built its power on three commodities: timber, fish, and salt. But salt was the keystone. Without salt, the fish rotted. Without preserved fish, ships couldn't make long voyages. Without long voyages, no trade network. The Hanseatic League didn't just trade in salt. It traded in control of Northern European commerce for 3 centuries. These weren't free markets. Every salt route was monitored, taxed, and defended. Smuggling salt became a capital offense in many kingdoms because salt smuggling wasn't just theft. It was rebellion against the economic order itself. And then there were the wars. The wars of white gold. Salt and economic power became inseparable from military power. The Venetian-Genoese wars of the 13th and 14th centuries were fought partly over salt production rights in the Mediterranean. Thousands died. Cities burned. Why? Because control of salt meant control of food preservation, which meant control of naval power, which meant control of Mediterranean trade. The wars weren't about salt. They were about everything salt made possible. In China, the salt monopolies became instruments of state power so total that they funded entire dynasties. By the Tang Dynasty, salt taxation provided half of all government revenue. The salt administration became one of the largest bureaucracies in human history, employing tens of thousands of officials whose sole purpose was monitoring salt production, distribution, and sale. When salt merchants tried to circumvent state control, rebellions erupted. The Huangqiao Rebellion of 874-884 CE, which left millions dead and devastated the empire, began with salt smugglers defying imperial monopolies. The pattern repeats across civilizations because the logic is inescapable. Salt preserves food. Preserved food feeds armies. Armies conquer territory. Territory contains people who need salt. And the cycle begins again, tighter each time. But perhaps nowhere was this cycle more visible than in colonial empires, where salt in ancient civilizations evolved into salt as instrument of subjugation. The British Raj and the salt of subjugation. When the British East India Company consolidated control over India, they inherited and expanded the Mughal salt monopoly. What followed was exploitation refined to mathematical precision. The salt tax under British rule became one of the most hated instruments of colonial control. Indians were forbidden from collecting or producing salt from their own coastlines, their own soil, despite living in a subcontinent surrounded by salt water. They had to buy government salt, heavily taxed government salt. Salt that cost significantly more than it would cost to simply evaporate seawater. This wasn't economic policy, it was economic violence. The salt tax fell hardest on the poorest, for whom salt was one of the few ways to preserve food and make meagre diets palatable. Families went into debt, villages suffered malnutrition, and the British collected revenue. By the early 20th century, the salt tax generated millions of pounds annually for the colonial government. It was one of the primary funding mechanisms for British rule in India. Every handful of salt represented another rupee extracted from people who had no voice in how they were governed. And then came Mahatma Gandhi. The Salt March of 1930 was brilliant precisely because it understood this history. Gandhi walked 240 miles to the Arabian Sea and picked up a handful of salt from the beach, violating the Salt Act. This simple act, gathering natural salt from natural seawater, was illegal. Gandhi's genius was making visible the absurdity and cruelty of colonialism through the most basic of substances. Thousands joined him. Thousands more were arrested. The Salt March didn't immediately free India, but it demonstrated that control of salt had always been about control of people, and that people could refuse. The British salt monopoly ended in 1946. India gained independence in 1947. These facts are not unrelated. The transformation. The Industrial Revolution did to salt what it did to many ancient systems. It destroyed the scarcity that enabled control. The development of industrial salt mining and chemical production in the 19th century flooded markets with cheap salt. Suddenly, the substance that had funded empires cost almost nothing to produce. But the patterns didn't disappear. They transformed. Modern food systems remain dependent on salt, though now invisibly. The processed food industry uses salt as a preservative and flavor enhancer in almost everything. We consume far more salt than our ancestors ever did, not because we choose to, but because the economic logic of food production makes salt-preserved, salt-enhanced foods cheaper to manufacture and distribute. The control is subtler now, embedded in supply chains and ingredient lists rather than in armed guards at salt pans. The history of salt reveals a template that repeats with other resources: oil, rare earth minerals, lithium, water itself. Identify what is essential, control its production or distribution. Use that control to extract wealth and maintain power. The substance changes, the pattern doesn't. This is why the story matters beyond historical curiosity. The hidden legacy. Today, in a world where salt is abundant and cheap, we've forgotten what it once meant. We've forgotten the salt routes that became our highways, the salt taxes that sparked revolutions, the salt monopolies that funded empires. But the systems built on salt control left infrastructure, both physical and conceptual, that we still inhabit. The modern nation-state, with its taxation systems and monopolies on essential services, learned from salt. The concept that government can tax basic necessities, that control of infrastructure equals control of populations, that economic policy can be a form of violence. These ideas were refined in salt administration offices from Rome to Beijing to London. Walk those old salt routes today and you'll find highways, rail lines, fibre optic cables. The paths of power remain the same, carrying different resources, serving different empires. The principles endure. Whoever controls what people cannot live without controls those people. But there's something else in this history, something Gandhi understood. The very totality of control makes it fragile. When everyone needs something and everyone knows the system is unjust, that system relies entirely on people's willingness to comply. The British salt monopoly seemed absolute until millions of Indians simply refused it. The empire that had ruled through salt crumbled when its subjects walked to the sea. Salt built the ancient world. It funded pharaohs and emperors. It carved trade routes across deserts and oceans. It decided which cities would thrive and which would fade into dust. For thousands of years, those who controlled salt controlled wealth, controlled armies, controlled the future. The white crystals we sprinkle carelessly on our food today were once worth dying for, killing for, rebelling for. They were the foundation of the first great systems of taxation, the first monopolies, the first bureaucracies designed to extract wealth from basic human needs. This history lives in everything we've built since, in our economic systems, in our infrastructure, in our concepts of power and control. The empires are gone, but the patterns persist, applied to new resources, new technologies, new forms of dependence. Salt's story is humanity's story. Our genius for organization turned toward domination, our need for essential things transformed into leverage against us, and occasionally our capacity to recognize injustice and refuse it. The next time you reach for salt, remember, you're touching something that shaped the world, something that built empires and brought them down, something that reveals what we are when we control what others need to survive. And ask yourself, what is the salt of our age? What essential thing have we allowed to become an instrument of control? What empire is being built while we're not paying attention? The answers are there, scattered like white crystals across the landscape of modern life, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be understood, just as they always have been.